Welcome to Molden and Schmidt, the podcast where we talk about the future of motoring and, crucially, how to make it more sustainable. I'm Nick Molden, Chief Executive of Emissions Analytics.
Hi, I'm Oliver Schmidt. I've been working in the automotive industry for more than 25 years, but of course I'm mostly known for my involvement in the Volkswagen diesel scandal.
And for our second series, we're also joined by Felix Leach. He's Associate Professor of Engineering Science at the University of Oxford and author of a book called Racing Towards Zero. Hi, Felix.
Hello.
So the motivation for the second series, so Felix and I have been working on a concept which we'll explain and explore over the next few episodes. The idea boils down to the future of taxation and that it should be based upon the weight of vehicles and the miles driven. We're so taken by this idea, we've written a book about it. It's called Critical Mass, the one thing you need to know about green cars. We're going to look at how this works and why it matters. Oliver's role here is as critical friend, and he's free to be as critical as he likes, using his expertise to really put the idea and us through our paces and to stress test the idea. But to start with, Felix, over to you. Please explain how we got thinking about this and the origin of the idea.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks for your warm welcome as well. So probably about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, something like that, Nick and I were talking at a conference, and we were sort of thinking about the fact that the auto industry is changing, that the cars on our roads are changing as well. 20, 30 years ago, every car had an internal combustion engine, and you could measure everything at the tailpipe, and that gave you at least some sense of the environmental impact of that vehicle. But today the world's really different. There's lots of battery electric vehicles on the roads, lots of hybrids on the roads. In some places you've even got hydrogen cars on the roads. You've also got different fuels, whether that's biofuels. In the future we might also have e-fuels. And so the world has become much more complicated. And one of the things that we as a society, if I can say it like that, seek to do is to try and account for the environmental impact of our vehicles. And in general, governments do that through taxation, at least in part. So, for example, in the EU, you pay, in most countries, tax based on the CO2 emissions of your vehicle at the tailpipe. And in many other countries have some sort of petrol or gasoline tax as well, where effectively the petrol you use creates the emissions. And so you're sort of, in some respect, accounting for the environmental impact. But as we go to these new types of vehicles, that kind of breaks down. And the other thing we observed, of course, was that vehicles are getting heavier. In the EU, it's about 14% in the last 20 years. In China, it's more like 25% in the last 15 years. So we've got this problem of vehicles getting heavier and different vehicles on the roads that we're sort of struggling to understand and account for the environmental impact. And so Nick and I had a conversation, and we've come up with this sort of proposal, I suppose, that we should tax cars based on a combination of their weight and the distance you drive each year.
And I would add to that there's a problem of revenue for governments. I mean, across most of Europe, budget deficits are left, right, and centre. And I mean, Germany's held the line of balanced budgets for as long as it has been able to, but even now that's beginning to come apart. And the UK relies for £30 billion a year on motoring taxation. And with the move to the electric, that's going to go down a lot. Now, it's easy to say something's got to be done. What's more likely to happen is that governments will kick this into the future and let a future government sort out the declining revenue. What we're saying is, actually, here's a way of getting ahead of that and underpinning those revenues. Not get more taxation, but just to underpin where we are today in a way. So it solves that problem, but it also solves the environmental taxation as well. So this, in our view, Oliver, this ticks many of the boxes, and it's simple and easy to understand and execute. What do you think?
So your idea is basically just to keep the level of taxation that we had in the past, when every vehicle was powered by an ICE and the government had the steady revenue. So you don't want to add an additional tax to offset really climate issues, to offset whatever negative effects cars have. You just want to have the taxation to keep the roads and the bridges and everything, but you don't want to have an additional offset.
That's the basic. That's the basic idea. Yes, because we're not politicians. We're not in the business of arguing for more or less taxation. What we're saying is you can get the same amount of taxation, but also create the right incentives for people to go for the greenest cars.
Yeah. Okay.
And of course, one of the interesting things as we were doing the research for the book is different countries tax car travel at different levels, right? The US is very different to Germany, which is different to the UK, which is different to Japan. And so we look at all these countries in the book and just say, let's just assume that the size of the revenue is the same as that country has today.
Yeah. So you want to, how do you want then to balance subsidies and taxes?
So this is only looking at specifically the taxation side of it. The subsidy side of it tends to be where a lot of the damaging activity is happening, in that it is subsidies attached to favoured technologies. And that is through the company car tax system. It's through various parts of the existing car tax system. And that's actually where governments are really bad at this, of picking the right technologies. It is theoretically possible to make subsidies which do encourage the right behaviour. So you could actually have, theoretically, subsidies for the very lightest vehicles. But that's not what we've got today. So it would be better, we're arguing, rather than going down this banning technologies, picking winners, we use this type of taxation system that's aligned to the environmental damage to drive behaviour, rather than subsidies and bans and mandates.
So if I understand this correctly, so looking at Germany, at the moment, the only subsidies I get if I drive an EV is that I don't pay taxes. I don't pay any taxes. So the regular tax that everybody has to pay, I think you're exempt with an EV for 4 years, that you don't have to pay taxes. So that's the big advantage I have. All the other subsidies that were there have been cancelled late 2023. So this is the only advantage I have at the moment. And of course, if I have solar power at home or at work, I basically charge for free, and I don't pay the gas tax or petrol tax that you mentioned before, Felix. So is the basic idea of your book to spread this out more even? Because I'm driving my heavy EV at the moment, I'm using all the roads, but I'm not paying to maintain the roads.
I suppose I'd start by saying, Oliver, our starting point wasn't necessarily about taxation, although we have come to taxation. It was more that in driving your EV, you do have an environmental impact. It may be slightly different to the impact of having an internal combustion engine vehicle. So we thought, okay, well, can we try and get a simple metric, ideally one metric, that can account for the environmental impact of a vehicle? And we came up with weight or vehicle mass in the sort of scientific jargon as that metric. And then we from there we moved to taxation. And so yes, ideally what we would do is we would replace the annual tax that you would pay in the UK. We call it vehicle excise duty, but each country has its own name. With this new weight and distance based tax, in order that vehicles' environmental impact is actually taken into account by the taxation system, rather than, certainly in the UK until April this year, if you drive an EV, you don't pay any tax at all. You don't pay tax on the electricity, you don't pay any annual tax, although that annual tax will come in from April. There's zero tax basically on EVs right now in the UK.
It would be very easy for this to get tangled up with the pro-anti-EV question. And it's very much not intended to be that. It's really looking forward to a world where we're largely electrified. And if we don't introduce some sort of fair taxation, then there'll be a significant fiscal gap. And in that largely electrified world, what do we want the fleet on the road to look like? If it is full of Cybertrucks, then that is likely to be pretty bad for the environment. But if it is a mixed and including lots of much smaller EVs, and still including some hybrids, that'll be a much more optimal mix. And what we're saying to governments is if you tackle it now, you can actually deal with the most optimal transition and also have something that works in the end game. If you don't tackle it now, you'll have distortions in the transition and you'll end up with a fiscal black hole. So it's much better to tackle it now. And actually, what we've shown in the book is it is possible to have this as a universal solution. This isn't an EV tax. This is something that would apply to EVs, internal combustion engines, and everything in between. And it would work to enable the smoothest and, I guess, most environmentally efficient transition.
Yeah, this was exactly where my question was aiming at, because if you would really at the moment now tomorrow put a tax in place that is based on the weight and mileage driven, you would be considered anti-EV. This is a big advantage you have at the moment. But if you come from a different approach, if you say, okay, let's take, for example, a toll road. If I drive with my EV on a toll road, I have to pay the tolls. It's not for free for me. So I think this is the way how you have to see it. You have to see it. It's really, you have to pay to get the roads maintained. I don't know how familiar you are with our German Autobahn system here at the moment in Germany. We have this one which is connecting the area around the Nürburgring with the Ruhrgebiet. This Autobahn is interrupted by a missing bridge. So what took 10 minutes in the past now takes 2 hours, because the whole traffic that is connecting these areas is going through a little village at the bottom of the former bridge. The bridge have been blown up. And on this Autobahn, there are 45 bridges or 50 bridges, and most of them need to be renewed within the next 5 years. So I totally understand your concept that we need money to pay for the maintenance of those bridges.
And it's science. And Felix done a lot of the calculations around the impact on infrastructure. Is a very clear. It's well understood in science, and it's a physical process, and that's what we've tried to do in the book, is to bring it all back to science and analysis and facts, rather than what happens so often is trading very emotional positions. But I mean, Felix, you've looked at the infrastructure impact in quite a lot of detail, and it is something. I mean, I would call it it is a pollutant in a sense. It's a vehicle having an external impact on the environment that the driver is not properly paying for. It's a real thing.
It to be, potholes in roads, they're typically, axle weight is actually the main thing that causes kind of wear and tear on the road. So that's why kind of heavy goods vehicles, trucks, have more axles to kind of spread the weight more evenly. But pretty much every car has 2 axles. So the axle weight is directly proportional to the overall weight of the vehicle. So potholes depends generally on axle weight, and it's a bit of a rule of thumb, but it goes up with the 4th power of the axle weight. So it's not a linear correlation at all. It's a really kind of quartic correlation, as we would say. But it's not just roads, right? It's car parks, multi-story car parks were designed with a certain vehicle weight in mind. They're now having to be maintained more carefully. Bridges, like you were saying, Oliver. And of course, governments, depending on where you are in the world, need to pay for this. And, in the US, some states where they have very strict budget rules, and you can only use gas tax and the road tax to pay for the roads, they're now having to charge hybrids and EVs more for their annual fees because they don't pay the gas tax in the US. So, there's really kind of anti-hybrid and anti-EV incentives built into some US state systems in the taxation system. And we said, well, look, this has got to stop. We've got to just try and level the playing field and get all vehicles taxed fairly.
Yeah. And level playing field, that's a crucial phrase, because a bridge doesn't care whether it's a 2.5-ton EV or a 2.5-ton internal combustion engine. And it's absolutely true that there are loads of heavy internal combustion engines, and the trend has been towards heavier and heavier vehicles. But it is also true that on average, EVs are probably about a third heavier than an equivalent internal combustion engine. So on average, EVs will take more of a toll on the infrastructure. But we're not the people saying multi-story car parks are spontaneously going to explode. which is sometimes how it's conveyed in the newspapers. This
but
will be more, it is the long-term maintenance problem
but there's
and the quality degradation that will happen just systematically.
But there's also another problem with all this car parking. So just go into a town that built all their parking structure 20, 30 years ago and have a newer, bigger car, try to find a parking space.
Yeah.
If you have these white lines on the side, on the left and right, so if you fit between those lines, you can't open your doors anymore in some of them because they have been designed 40, 50 years ago with the Volkswagen Beetle in mind.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
it's absolutely true. It's a real thing, and it is just like, I hesitate to say potholes, but it is actually something where the heavy vehicles and it includes heavier trucks as well, but heaviness running on roads is taking a toll on the infrastructure, which is a real cost that we have to pay. Someone has to pay for that, or we have a reduced quality of life. What we're saying, let's be realistic, and also let's be technology agnostic about it, and we can show that it's mass that matters, and let's focus on that and come up with a pragmatic solution before our whole infrastructure is degraded.
So do you name it really a tax in your book, or do you really describe it as a different system that you say it's more like a toll system or a road usage fee? Because if you stay with the word that we use today, you might run into all these issues. They're EV haters, and so on and so on. So do you point out that this really is something that is there to pay for the usage of the road?
Yeah, so we do call it a tax, Oliver, but we also talk about how we might phase it in. I think often with lots of taxation systems, the end point is perhaps obvious, but how you get there is actually quite tricky. And so our proposal is that actually you would phase this in accordance with the proportion of EVs on the road. So, overnight you would abolish the annual charge that you pay. But then the phasing in of the charge would depend on the proportion of EVs, because that's, of course, the bit of the gas tax that you're losing as a government, right? So you would phase it in proportion with the BEVs on the road, and that way you do retain the revenue neutrality pretty much absolutely. But also it's a bit of an easier transition. So someone who's bought a particular type of vehicle isn't suddenly hit with a massive tax the following day, And I think that combination of revenue neutrality, I'm not a politician. I don't think I want to judge whether you should pay more or less tax for driving overall. I just think we need to sort of cut the pie a bit differently. And importantly, we've got a plan for how we would phase it in so that people aren't kind of hit overnight with massive bills.
Yeah, but absolutely, and there's another really important reason why we don't position it, and it isn't like a toll, because there's very few steps then towards road pricing, and this is it's absolutely not cameras and tracking where people go. It's not about dynamic pricing of doubling the price at rush hour. People don't like this, and crucially, it's not necessary. So we would simply use the miles driven from the annual, we call it MOT, the periodic technical inspection that goes on in most countries, and multiply that by the known weight, the official curb weight of the vehicle. So there will be no knowledge of where people are traveling to, and that's why it's actually, in a sense, it's better to have it as a tax. And also, it has to be said, most governments prefer those sorts of taxes because they're not hypothecated. They don't go into some really discrete fund to fund something. They are part of general taxation. Yeah. Certainly the UK Treasury is very phobic to any hypothecation of revenue. So we don't want to have that battle. We're happy for it to work in exactly the same way, unhypothecated, but it is generating revenue in proportion to the environmental damage.
So as in my past, I was somehow involved in finding loopholes in legislations. So my question is now, so you come up with a proposal that is combining weight and mileage driven. So then, is there any offset for older vehicles? So otherwise, I would buy myself a whatever Opel. I think you call it. I think you call it a Vauxhall Astra or something that weighs 800 kilograms, and I'm better off than in any new car. Is there an offset?
And arguably, your environmental impact, at least on certain metrics, is also lower. Not on tailpipe, and I concede that.
Yeah.
But on your impact on the infrastructure, it would be lower than if you bought
you're
a
right.
1,600 kilogram equivalent, modern equivalent to that. I think I would say two things to that, Oliver. Firstly, old vehicles are exiting the fleet, and tailpipes of almost all vehicles post 2018 are very clean. And those vehicles are now forming a majority of the fleet, and most vehicles, I mean, average vehicles lifetime is about 13 to 15 years, something like that. So relatively short order, those vehicles will be exiting the fleet and will form a real minority. So if you were keen, you could do that. I think the other thing I would say is that we would retain for fossil fuels a fossil fuel tax. So if you wished to fill it up with fossil gasoline, then you would still have to pay additional taxation for that fossil gasoline. But in doing that, you would of course incentivize sustainable fuels like e-fuels or synthetic fuels and so on. So if you bought your Opel Astra and it was 800 kilograms and you ran it on a syn fuel, actually your environmental impact might be very low.
Yeah, and I don't have the CO2 emissions of building a new car and all this stuff. Yeah, exactly. Of course. Yeah.
Very much. Plus, also empirically, the older the vehicle, the fewer miles they're driven annually anyway. I guess as it gets older, you go easy. You only use it on relatively light duty tasks. And so whatever the vehicle, even if it is a Tesla Cybertruck, if you're driving it a relatively small number of miles every year, the total environmental impact is going to be quite modest. And in fact, that's where internal combustion engines win over electric vehicles, because there's fewer emissions embedded in making the thing in the first place. The one thing you want to do if you buy an electric vehicle is use it a lot. So put it the other way around, a lightly used, very old internal combustion engine that's very light is not having a great deal of impact on the environment. And as Felix said, they're exiting the fleet relatively quickly anyway. So if you want to go ahead and buy that old Astra, go ahead. It really doesn't make a great deal of difference one way or the other.
No, I stay with my electric car. I'm fine, thanks.
Well, I think we're very easily going to jump into the details of this, and I think for today we wanted to keep it the broad background and the motivation for this. So I think we probably will draw a close to our discussion for today, but to chart the way forward to the next edition. So the next edition of this, we want to get more into the science of this. So look at the relationship between the various pollutants we've studied and mass and other factors that we've considered as well. So we'll tackle that next, and then on later editions we'll look at more of the practice and the politics of it. And as you alluded to, Oliver, how can you cheat the system? That's absolutely something which you'll, I'm sure, ask us some very relevant questions on.
I've one more question before we finish today. So this idea of lightweight vehicles and everything, this somehow comes to my memory when we discussed greenhouse gas 2 and tier 3 and LEV 3 with EPA and CARB. They always had a base. There was a study done by Lotus, and this focused very much on lightweight. Did this have any influence on your view of the topics? Are you familiar with that study that was the base for those legislations?
No. Tell us.
Yeah, tell us more.
No, this is when there was mainly the EPA when they came up with the greenhouse gas 2 regulation. They had a study which showed how much a vehicle could be made better year by year, how much your gain in fuel economy would be. And one topic that they always featured, which never came to light, was that cars were getting lighter. And when you read this study, it was always there was a lot of focus of cars getting lighter, but they might have gotten lighter, but they also got bigger because of the footprint. So then maybe if you build the factor car weight per square centimeter, it got lighter, but because the car got much bigger, the car got heavier. And of course, with the trend from sedans to SUVs, they also got higher. So cars just got heavier, as you pointed out earlier. So this study was done by Lotus and was a base for the calculation of how greenhouse gas 2 was supposed to be brought into regulation. So I was just thinking of
one thing that we'll talk about on a later episode, no doubt, is the fact that in the US there are fewer cars today and more, by classification at least, light trucks, which have different CO2 regulations and so on, but they're much heavier.
Yeah. And one consequence of our system, if introduced, would be actually it would really incentivize lightweighting. So it might actually help make it a reality. It's something that's easily talked about, but it entirely is defied by the reality of what's going on, where we've been on a multi-decade trend of heavier and heavier vehicles, and so there's no incentive or little incentive for manufacturers to invest in genuinely lightweighting, but this could turn that tide. And that's ultimately I think that would be the benefit all round for the environment. So so thank you very much for that. I'm going to draw a halt to it today, but thank you very much, Felix, for setting out the background to it. Oliver, some great questions, and I look forward to many more on the next edition. So look out for that. We'll be coming soon, looking at more at the science of it. The book itself, Critical Mass, is available through many platforms. So please do get your copy and fire in any questions to us as well. I mean, this is very much a conversation. This is an idea that will that time is coming but needs refinement. Yeah. We are also working with organisations to work it up into a full practical policy proposal as well to work out all the ways people can try and get around the system and to work out those nuances, so we can actually present to a government a fully formed idea that could be implemented. So thank you very much, Felix, Oliver, again, and thanks everyone to listening, and we'll join you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.